You've been doing everything right. You're creating notes, you're adding links, you're building connections between your ideas. And then one day you open the graph view and there it is, this beautiful sprawling web of everything you've captured into your Obsidian vault. It looks just like the second brain you always imagined having. And then you wait for the payoff, the insight, the moment where all those connections suddenly help you to think differently, to be more productive, and to be more creative. And it doesn't come. Here's what nobody tells you. That big graph view, it's great for one thing, and that is looking impressive. After 5 years of using Obsidian every single day, I barely ever open it. But there is another kind of graph view that I use constantly, one that actually delivers that PKM payoff that you were promised at the beginning of your Obsidian journey. And in this video, I'm gonna show you the difference and show you exactly where and when each one of these is worth your time. By the way, this video is the 8th video in my Obsidian for Beginners series. If you're new to Obsidian, this playlist is the place to start. You can find a link to the playlist in the description below. So before we get into what's actually useful, let's make sure we're on the same page about what the graph view actually is in Obsidian, because I think a lot of people open it for the first time and they assume they're supposed to already know what they're looking at. It's a little bit confusing. At its most basic level, the graph view is a visual map of all the connections in your entire Obsidian vault. Every note you've ever created shows up as a dot or a node on this graph view, and every link between two notes shows up as a line connecting those dots on this graph. The more links a note has, the bigger its node appears, and that is the graph view in a nutshell. Now to open the graph view, you just click on the icon in the ribbon by the left sidebar, or you can open the command palette with Command P on Mac or Control P on Windows and select the Open Graph View command. Either way, it opens up the graph view and it gives you a visual representation of all the notes in your entire Obsidian vault. Once it's open, you can zoom in and out with your scroll wheel, click and drag to pan around the graph view, and click on any individual node to open that note in Obsidian. As your vault grows, you may have hundreds or even thousands of notes connected here. And the more notes you add, the more impressive this big graph view becomes. And that is exactly the problem. The bigger this graph view becomes, the harder it gets to glean anything useful from it. When everything's connected to everything, it looks really impressive, don't get me wrong, but it really doesn't tell you anything. If you're looking at a city from 30,000 feet, you know there are a lot of important details down there, but you can't read a single street sign. That's kind of what the graph view is, in my opinion. Now that said, the graph view does have a real set of features, and some of them can be useful in certain scenarios. So let's walk through all of them here quickly, because understanding what the big graph can do and what it can't do is what makes the local graph, which is really where the magic happens, make sense when we cover it later. Now the graph view has 4 sets of controls, all living in a panel that you can open by clicking the gear icon in the upper right corner of the graph view. Let's walk through each one. The first is filters. This is where you control what shows up in the graph at all. So from here, you can limit what notes are displayed in the graph by searching for specific notes. You can do this by typing in the search box, and the graph view will update to only show notes that match your search criteria. If you just type text into the search box, it will show all notes that contain that text somewhere in the note itself, not just in the title. But you can get more specific than that. So for example, you could type path : followed by a folder name to show only notes inside that folder. You can also type tag : followed by a tag name to show only notes with that tag. If you want to get really precise, you can combine these with Boolean operators like and, or, and the minus sign for exclusion. So for example, you could type tag : project and path : work to show only notes that have the project tag and live inside your work folder. Or you could type minus path : templates to hide your templates folder from the graph entirely. Now, by the way, that last one, the exclusion modifier, is probably the most practically useful thing in this entire panel, because most vaults have notes that exist only for utility reasons. These could be templates, daily notes, Claude skills, attachments, etc. They're not really part of your thinking network, but they show up in that big graph view and they create a lot of noise. So filtering them out with the minus path : modifier immediately makes the graph view more readable. There are also several toggles in the filters section. You can toggle tags on to display tags in the graph view, toggle attachments on to show attachments in your media folder, and toggle existing files only to remove any links to notes that don't exist yet. And you can also toggle off orphans if you want to hide all notes in your vault that don't contain a connection to another note. The second option here is groups, and this lets you color code your nodes in the graph view based on search queries. So for example, you could make all your book notes blue, or all your project notes green, all your people notes yellow. Doing this helps you spot clusters and patterns visually in your graph view. Now in practice, I find this more useful for screenshots and demonstrations than for actual thinking work. But if you are someone who thinks visually, it can be a helpful way to see whether your vault is balanced or lopsided towards certain kind of notes. The third option is display, and this controls how the graph looks. You can adjust the size of the nodes, the thickness of the links, and the text fade threshold, which determines how far you have to zoom in before note titles start appearing. There's also a toggle for arrows if you want to see the direction of your note links, and an animate button if you want to render an animation of your graph view being built from scratch. Now most of these are purely cosmetic, but the text fade threshold is worth adjusting if you find yourself constantly zooming in just to read note names. The last option here is forces, and this is the one that confuses people the most because it sounds really technical, but it's really just controlling how the graph arranges itself on screen. So center force pulls everything toward the middle, repel force pushes nodes away from each other so they don't pile up on top of each other. Link force controls how strongly connected notes are pulled toward each other, and finally link distance controls how far apart linked notes sit. So adjusting these can make a dense vault more readable, but honestly, and I say this after 5 years, I've never found a configuration here that makes this big graph genuinely useful for thinking. It's always just been a different version of really impressive looking chaos. So here's my honest takeaway after all of that. The big graph view is genuinely useful in a couple of scenarios. The first is for vault health checks. It can be useful for finding orphan notes, spotting imbalances in how your ideas are connected, or doing a periodic review of what's actually in your system. The second scenario is for visually explaining the way that links work to someone who's brand new to Obsidian. If you're new to the channel and you're watching me explain this graph view, you kind of instantly get it. With a small beginner vault, this is the single best visual demonstration of why linking notes matters. But as a daily thinking tool, it has limited usefulness. And the reason it's not built for that is actually the key to understanding what the local graph does differently. That's exactly where we're gonna go next. The local graph is a dynamic graph view that updates based on the currently active note, and it does one thing the big graph view can't. It shows you the entire connected world around a single note. Not your entire vault, just the notes that are directly connected to the one that you're currently working on. Open any note, open the local graph, and you will see that note at the center with everything linked to it arranged around it. So to open the local graph like this, click the 3 dots in the upper right of any note at the top of your editor and select Open Linked View, Open Local Graph. You can also use the command palette by hitting Command P on Mac or Control P on Windows and running the Graph View Open Local Graph command. Either way, the local graph now opens in a new tab, and I recommend that you drag this into either the right or left sidebar so that it's always visible in Obsidian while you're working. That way, when you open a new note, the local graph instantly updates to show the links to and from the current note and gives you a visual representation of all the connections that exist. Now, the local graph has most of the same controls as the big graph: filters, groups, display settings, and forces. And since we covered those in the previous section, you already know what those do. But there are 2 settings that matter more than others here, and they're both specific to how the local graph works. So the first setting is called depth. By default, the local graph shows you notes that are 1 link away from your current note. It's immediate neighbors, if you will. So the notes that show up with a depth level of 1 are all notes that either link to the current note or are linked from the current note. But if you increase the depth level to 2, now you'll start to see the neighbors of your neighbors. And these are notes that are connected to your connected notes. This is where things start to get a little bit interesting because you start to see clusters of ideas that relate to your current note without being directly linked to it. So I don't use this often, but it can be really handy once in a while when you want to really explore how things are connected in your vault. So most of the time I leave the depth set to 1, but I occasionally do increase it to 2 if I want to get a little bit more creative about how these things are connected. I wouldn't really recommend going beyond that though. After that, the local graph starts to look a lot like that big graph again, and it's just too much information to actually do anything with. The second important setting here is the exclusion filter, which again, you already understand from the big graph. By using the -path: modifier, for example, you can hide your templates folder, your daily notes, and your utility files from the local graph and make the connections you see there even more meaningful. This is important because in the local graph, clutter is even more disruptive than it is in that big one. You're trying to see the specific, meaningful connections around one specific idea. So every irrelevant node makes it a little bit harder to see the forest through the trees. So with depth set and your utility folders filtered out, here's what you're left with: a clean, focused map of how one idea connects to the rest of your thinking. And that is where the PKM payoff actually lives. So this is what thinking in connected notes actually feels like in practice. You're not staring at a beautiful web of your entire vault, but you're glancing at the neighborhood around one idea while you're actively working inside it. So let me give you an example from my sermon sketch notes, which is basically the first thing that I built when I started using Obsidian over 5 years ago. I have all these sketch notes that I bring in that contain embedded or transcluded notes for each individual verse that I mentioned in my sketchnote files. This allows me to open up a sketch note, see all the verses that are linked to that note in the local graph, click on one of those dots to open that verse, and see all the other notes that link to that specific first note. If I want to see things next to each other, I can hold the Command key and open each note in a new tab, then drag those notes around my workspace in Obsidian so I can see them side by side. Obviously, you can apply this concept a lot of different ways. If you have set up your vault correctly, you've created atomic notes, and you have intentionally created links between them. So now you understand both views, the big graph view for getting vault level perspective and that local graph for note level thinking. But there's a question underneath all of this that's worth addressing directly. If the big graph view has limited usefulness as a daily thinking tool, why does it exist? Or at least, why is it so prominent? Why do so many people get excited about it? The honest answer is that the graph view is doing something important, just not what most people think it is. When you first open that graph view and you see your vault rendered as a living web of connected ideas, something clicks. You understand viscerally why linking notes matters. You see that your vault isn't just a folder full of markdown files. It's a network of connected notes and ideas. And that moment of understanding is genuinely valuable. It's a tipping point for a lot of people in their PKM journey. And the graph view is one of the best tools for introducing someone who is new to Obsidian to that paradigm shift that is linked thinking. But there is this gap between understanding something and getting practical value from it. And most people who fall in love with that graph view are stuck in that first moment of inspiration. It doesn't actually translate into a workflow that actually helps them be more productive or creative in their day-to-day. Now I'm harping on this because it's worth being honest about. There is a real cost to over-investing or over-indexing on that big graph view. The time you spend making your graph look beautiful, color coding the nodes, tweaking the physics forces, building this elaborate group filters just to get a clean visual is time not spent actually thinking with the notes themselves. So that graph is a reflection of your vault, but you can't improve your thinking by working on the reflection. And I've noticed that the creators who I see get the most out of Obsidian tend to mostly ignore the big graph view after that initial setup phase. They use it occasionally for vault health checks like I described here, but they use that local graph regularly while working with their notes and ideas in their PKM system. They put their energy into the notes themselves, building links that are intentional and meaningful, and writing in ways that create real connections between their ideas. Which brings us to the last thing that is worth covering here: what to actually do with the information from this video. Well, first, if you've never set up your local graph as a persistent panel in your Obsidian user interface, do that. Dock it on the right side of your screen, set the depth level to 1, and filter out any utility folders. Then just work normally for a week and notice what you see. That's it. Pretty simple, really. But that one change will do more for your linked thinking practice than any amount of time that you spend toying with the big graph view. Now, if you do want to use the big graph view productively, use it for one specific purpose: a quarterly vault review. Filter down to orphan notes and look for notes that have no connections, ask yourself whether they should. That's a legitimate use of the tool. Timebox is purposeful, it's directly connected to improving your vault rather than just admiring it. And if you find yourself spending a lot of time tweaking that graph view, just notice that. It's admittedly very fun to play with, but it doesn't really help you all that much. Organizing and aestheticizing our thinking systems may feel productive, but the big graph views that look the most impressive are rarely the ones doing the actual work. All right, so that'll do it for this video on how to actually use the graph view. Hopefully you understand the graph view a little bit better now, and you can start to use both the big graph view and the local graph to start making more out of the notes and ideas that are already in your Obsidian vault. But if you could use a little more help getting up and running with Obsidian, you should check out my free Practical PKM Starter Vault. It's a great way to see the local graph in action, as I've connected and tagged a collection of tips and resources that are all broken down by category, from basic PKM concepts to essential core features to time-saving keyboard hotkeys. There's also a collection of my own personal template files, as well as a markdown cheat sheet, a couple of shortcuts, even a habit tracking dashboard canvas file along with instructions on how to set it all up. If you could use a little help getting more out of your notes and ideas in Obsidian, you should definitely check it out. You can download it for free right now by going to practicalpkm.com/vault. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in another video.